In the previous videos, we covered a little bit about, what truth could mean in those fields. Just a little bit. It's obviously a lot more richer even in those fields, especially in the physical sciences. However, let's move on so that we just get a broad overview and we know a little bit about, most things. So let's move on to law. And I don't know anything about law per se, but there are certain principles that must be kept in mind when when one is reasoning about what is true. And there are a lot of, I suppose, these Latin sayings that those involved in the legal profession quote often. So there's one idea that, you know the thing speaks for itself. That is, the evidence that you're looking at, it's you can make an it's very obvious, very apparent what the truth is. Okay, for example, if say it's a murder, and there is, say, Jane and there's Jill, and you see that, and you know that Jill has a knife, and Jill's knife is in Jane's bod is like in Jane's stomach, or chest, or whatever, and Jill's fingerprints is there on the knife. And the question is that enough? And maybe with a little bit more evidence, or even as it is, that is enough, because it's an open and shut case kind of thing. Another example would be, there's an evidence of a man going in for surgery, and it just so happens that after the surgery, the man feels ill, and when he does an X-ray, there are certain surgical implements or swabs inside his abdomen or whatever. And that is the sequence of events and the information you have. It's enough to know what happens. I'm not telling you what happened, but you know what happened, right? You can infer. So that is one example of something being obvious. So then you can imagine, when would it not be obvious? When would there be reasonable doubt? So immediately here we come to the concept of, you know, how probability is used in the physical sciences and in law and, the social sciences. So there may be a threshold of evidence or information beyond which we can say, okay, we are fairly sure that this is what happened, and it's not reasonable to put that at 100%. We can never be 100% sure about anything, because we are relying on other people, and there'll be some loss of information, loss of trust and validity somewhere along. And another thing that is an insightful uh, thing that I'll share later, I mean, that I will share with you right now, is that as you increase evidence, you actually change the probability, and it can go backwards and forwards. If you Because uh, I mean, you have to question the veracity of the evidence and things like that. But first of all, if you present something and you change the sequence of the order in which you present, you may change the believability of your entire argument, and not just the sequence, but the number of facts or the number of things that you present, it may change the truth value. Not the truth value, the likelihood it will be believed. So, in law, right, it is possible to condemn an innocent man. It is possible, and that's not the truth has not been achieved in that court, but mistakes are made. So, what is the underlying principle, right? How is that? How do we frame where that threshold is, right? It should be a strong evidence. So we want that threshold of believability or of truth to be closer to 100%, but not exactly 100%. So how much? 85%, 90%, and it's impossible to measure per se. So you don't get a number. So you have to rely on some sort of subjective thought process, which is why I suppose uh, you know some legal systems employ juries or bench judges in really important cases. Anyways, I just wanted to come to like a nice principle in law that uh, is actually based on a biblical principle in the Bible, it's from the book of Genesis. So, in which order must I present it? Um, okay, I'll tell the story and then I'll tell how it has been used. So, the biblical story is that so basically in the book of Genesis, God wanted to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Uh, right. And Abraham says something like, uh, "Wait, Lord, my my nephew Lot is there, and he has his family." And then he says, "Yeah, well, I'll tell Lot to pack up and get the hell out of there, but make sure like nobody looks back and stuff like that." But then so once that is sorted out, Abraham is trying to reason with God to save the city. Okay, and so God accuses the people of the city of being in the wrong, so to speak. Let's not use difficult words with various high level concepts. They are in the wrong for some reason. God only knows. Now, how many good people, how many innocent people in the city would there have to be for God not to exact justice? Okay, so he says, what about 50? What about 45? And what about 5? What about 10, or what about 5? I'm not sure exactly what the number is. But even if there is a small number of innocent people, the ratio of the people in the wrong versus the people in the innocent, even if that, even if that, even if the ratio between the innocent people and those in the wrong was a very small ratio, like say 1 is to 10,000, we don't know what is the population of the city, then God would say, okay, fine, because I don't want to harm any innocent people, so I will save the city. And it was found out that not even that many innocent people were there. So God had to destroy the city. So that translates to a modern retrospective justification of a legal principle. And the legal principle is can be framed in this manner. Better that 10,000 or better than 1,000 criminals go free than an innocent person be held for a crime he did not commit. So, what we have here is a skew of based on a value distinction that we should not uh, condemn a person because they didn't do anything. That is more valuable. And even if the person who committed crimes was let go, we're making here like a priority. Like this is more important than that. Obviously, if we can, uh, we don't want either case. But if we had to choose, that is the distinction we would make. So, so it's things like this that really get you thinking about how to reason about truth. What do you value, and why do you value what you value? When you make a distinction, what would you prioritize? So I think that uh, just touching about truth in law. Okay, now we can come to, you know, an appreciation of how truth is used uh, in, literary criticism, literary criticisms of, uh, you know, authoritarian governments, and a social conception of truth. So I'm going to read a section from 1984 by George Orwell, and the context is, so basically the two people that you have to know. This is the torture scene where, okay, I don't, I mean, spoiler alert or whatever. There's a guy called Winston. He is the protagonist of the book. The book basically focuses on his narrative. And there's O'Brien, which is, a guy Winston thought was his friend or something, but works for the government and isn't really his friend anymore, something like that. So, without going into too much of the detail, let's see if you can just appreciate what's going on from this passage. All right? So basically, he's being grilled about what he thinks is true, and Winston is being grilled for what Winston thinks is true, and O'Brien is trying to question that essentially. So now Winston's answering. When I was arrested, Oceania was at war with East Asia, and then O'Brien asks, "With East Asia, good. And Oceania has always been at war with East Asia, has it not?" Winston drew in his breath. He opened his mouth to speak and then did not speak. He could not take his eyes away from the dial. "The truth, please, Winston. Your truth. Tell me what you think you remember." "I remember that, until only a week before I was arrested, we were not at war with East Asia at all. We were in an alliance with them. The war was against Eurasia. That had lasted for 4 years. Before that," O'Brien stopped him with a movement of his hand. "Another example," he said. "Some years ago, you had a very serious delusion indeed. You believed that three one-time party members named Jonas, Aronson, and Rutherford, men who were executed for treachery and sabotage after making the fullest possible confession, were not guilty of the crimes they were charged with. You believed that you had seen unmistakable documentary evidence proving that their confession was false. There was a certain photograph about which you had a hallucination. You believed that you had actually held it in your hands. It was a photograph something like this." An oblong slip of newspaper had appeared between O'Brien's fingers. For perhaps 5 seconds, It was within the angle of Winston's vision. It was a photograph, and there was no question about its identity. It was the photograph. It was another copy of the photograph of Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford at the party function in New York, which he had chanced upon 11 years ago and promptly destroyed. For only an instant it was before his eyes, and then it was out of his sight again. But he had seen it. Unquestionably, he had seen it. He made a desperate, agonizing effort to wrench the top half of his body free. It was impossible to move so much as a centimeter in any direction. For the moment, he had even forgotten the dial. All he wanted was to hold the photograph in his fingers again, or at least to see it. "It exists!" he cried. "No," said O'Brien. He stepped across the room. There was a memory hole in the opposite wall. O'Brien lifted the grating. Unseen, the frail slip of paper was whirling away on the current of warm air. It was vanishing in a flash of flame. O'Brien turned away from the wall. "Ashes," he said. "Not even identifiable ashes. Dust. It does not exist. It never existed. But it did exist. It does exist. It exists in memory. I remember it. You remember it." "I do not remember it," said O'Brien. Winston's heart sank. That was doublethink. He had a feeling of deadly helplessness. If he could have been certain that O'Brien was lying, it would not have seemed to matter. But it was perfectly possible that O'Brien had really forgotten the photograph. And if so, then he already would have forgotten his denial of remembering it and forgotten the act of forgetting. How could one be sure that it was simple trickery? Okay, so let's stop here and actually read that again, because uh, it's very nice how Orwell words that. Okay, so he's saying, so O'Brien says, this tangible piece of evidence that both of them had obviously just seen, you know, it doesn't it doesn't exist because it doesn't exist now, and there's no tangible proof saying that it ever existed. And O'Brien says, no, but it does exist. It exists in our memory. That tangible piece of evidence, which anyone could interact with and verify that it was true, now kind of just translates to some sort of, imprint upon our, our brain, our moist tissue inside somehow. Okay, and as far as we know right now, we can't take that out. And even if we do, it wouldn't we wouldn't know if that would be verifiable or not. It could be a dream, it could be, a false memory. And O'Brien says, and George Orwell says, if he could have been certain that O'Brien was lying, it would not have seemed to matter. But it was perfectly possible that O'Brien had really forgotten the photograph. I mean, a person who has that kind of a short-term memory loss, when engaging in conversation with them, it would be apparent that something was off in a lot of ways, I suppose. But if that was the case, if so, then already he would have forgotten his denial of remembering it and forgotten the act of forgetting. So, I'll say that again. He would have forgotten his denial of remembering it and forgotten the act of forgetting. So, I am saying it does not exist. But if in truth O'Brien says that it didn't exist, it never existed, he wouldn't say it never existed because he doesn't know what it is referring to. He doesn't know that. So we have here a contradiction, right? So I think What George Orwell is trying to say is that doublethink is essentially a contradiction. It is the most vile of falsehoods. That something like that. I would say. I think I'd probably be reaching. How could one be so sure that it was simple trickery? Perhaps that lunatic dislocation in the mind could really happen. That was the thought that defeated him. O'Brien was looking down at him speculatively. More than ever, he had an air of a teacher taking pains with a wayward but promising child. There is a party slogan dealing with the control of the past, he said. Repeat it, if you please. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past, repeated Winston obediently. Who controls the present controls the past. Who controls the past, present? Who controls who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past, repeated Winston obediently. Then O'Brien says, who controls the present controls the past, said O'Brien, nodding his head with slow approval. Is it your opinion of Winston that the past has real existence? Again, the feeling of helplessness descended upon Winston. His eyes flitted towards the dial. He not only did not know whether yes or no was the answer that would save him from pain, he did not even know which answer he believed to be the true one. So, what we have here is a little bit, I suppose, uh, disconcerting. Does the past have real existence? And I think this has to do something with the fact that, once you go forward in time, you can't go back. It's not something that you can verify. And unless you're like into physics and believe that, you're a four-dimensional being, you can traverse space-time in all directions or something like that. Once you go forward through time, as far as we know, as sentient beings, we can't go back. So it's virtually impossible to absolutely verify the truth of anything that happens in the past. So it's not about whether or not the past has real existence. It's impossible to prove it. And the way in which we understand that it does have real existence is because we have a memory, but because other people can verify it for us, and that may not be good enough, like on a rigorous basis, but it's good enough. It's good enough to get by life. All right. And this whole this what is this party slogan is essentially a really good mm, it's like a really good principle which encapsulates it's a really good statement which encapsulates what propaganda is, I suppose. So if you lie about what's happening in the present, if you lie about a different narrative, then maybe you can control, how the future is interpreted. And the whole idea is that this is a lie. This is a conscious lie, and you expect other people to buy into the narrative, either consciously or subconsciously, and you expect that over time people will forget that it was a conscious decision and will come to accept it, as gospel truth, just like that. So I suppose that is the basis of uh, the idea of propaganda being cultural bullshit. Again, the feeling of helplessness descended upon Winston. He did not even know whether yes or no was the answer that could save him from pain. He did not even know which answer he believed to be the true one. O'Brien smiled faintly. You are no metaphysician, Winston, he said. Until this moment, you had never even considered what is meant by existence. I will put it more precisely. Does the past exist concretely in space? Is there somewhere or some other place, a world of solid objects, where the past is still happening? No. Then where does the past exist, if at all? In records. It is written down in records and in the mind, in human memories. In memory. Very well then. We, the party, control all records and we control all memories. Then we control the past, do we not? But how can you stop people remembering things? Cried Winston, again momentarily forgetting the dial. It is involuntary. It is outside of oneself. How can you control memory? You have not controlled mine. O'Brien's manner grew stern again. He laid his hand on the dial. On the contrary, he said, you have not controlled it. That is what has brought you here. You are here because you have failed in humility, in self-discipline. You would not make the act of submission, which is the price of sanity. You prefer to be a lunatic, a minority of one. Only the disciplined mind, only the disciplined mind can see reality, Winston. You believe that reality is something objective, external, existing in its own right. You also believe that the nature of reality is self-evident. When you delude yourself into thinking that you see something, you assume that everyone else sees the same thing as you. But I tell you, Winston, that reality is not external. Reality exists in the human mind and nowhere else. Not in the individual mind, which can make mistakes and in any case soon perishes. Only in the mind of the party, which is collective and immortal. Whatever the party holds to be the truth is truth. It is impossible to see reality except by looking through the eyes of the party. That is the fact that you have got to relearn, Winston. It is an act of self-destruction, an effort of the will. You must humble yourself before you can become sane. He paused a few moments, as though to allow what he had been saying to sink in. Right. So, what O'Brien is saying, there is, it does make sense that, our memories aren't that great, or whatever narrative we've been cooking up for, whatever the story of our lives. There are a lot of elements that we interpret, and whenever we interpret something, we may change a little bit of the memory in order to make it more, narratively consistent. But then, parties themselves are composed of individual minds, and it's not all that clear that, how does consensus come about within multiple minds? So, but this is just assuming that, that everyone in the party, you can't see them, you don't know them, we don't know what's going on. So anything can happen. So there's a little bit of an uncertainty about that. So we have to assume that the party is, is the some sort of a sentient, is essentially a sentient entity that can decide how history is interpreted and really constructs reality by controlling the past, then a narrative of the past. Do you remember, he went on, writing in your diary, freedom is the freedom to say that 2 plus 2 make 4. Yes, said Winston. O'Brien held up his left hand, its back towards Winston, with the thumb hidden and the forefingers extended. How many fingers am I holding up, Winston? 4. And if the party says that it is not 4 but 5, then how many? 4. The word ended in a gasp of pain. The needle of the dial had shot up to 55. The sweat had sprung out all over Winston's body. The air tore into his lungs and issued again in deep groans, which even by clenching his teeth he could not stop. O'Brien watched him, the forefingers still extended. He drew back the lever. This time the pain was only slightly eased. How many fingers, Winston? 4. The needle went up to 60. How many fingers, Winston? 4, 4. What else can I say? 4. The needle must have risen again, but he did not look at it. This heavy, stern face and the 4 fingers filled his vision. The fingers stood up before his eyes like pillars, enormous, blurry, and seeming to vibrate, but unmistakably 4. How many fingers, Winston? 4, 4. Stop it. How can you go on? 4. How many fingers, Winston? 5, 5, 5. No, Winston, that is of no use. You are lying. You still think there are 4. How many fingers, please? 4, 5, 4. Anything you like. Only stop it. Stop the pain. Abruptly, he was sitting up with O'Brien's arm around his shoulders. He had perhaps lost consciousness for a few seconds. The bonds that had held his body down were loosened. He felt very cold. He was shaking uncontrollably. His teeth were chattering. The tears were rolling down his cheeks. For a moment he clung to O'Brien like a baby, curiously comforted by the heavy arm round his shoulders. He had the feeling that O'Brien was his protector, that the pain was something that came from outside, from some other source, and that it was O'Brien who would save him from it. "You are a slow learner, Winston," said O'Brien gently. "How can I help it?" he blubbered. "How can I help seeing what is in front of my eyes? 2 and 2 are 4. Sometimes, Winston. Sometimes they are 5. Sometimes they are 3. Sometimes they are all of them at once. You must try harder. It is not easy to become sane." I just got it's very disturbing if you really think about it, because O'Brien is saying that sanity is basically two things. Sanity is something that everyone believes, and that it's something that everyone believes because the party has deemed it so. So the social construction of reality, there is no disagreement there. There is complete concordance. And not only that, Winston shouldn't lie. So Winston should really believe that whatever is passing through his senses is not a good enough representation of what is real. I mean, I honestly don't know what to say about that. And there's also something else going on here which is not directly connected with truth, but in any rite of initiation, rite of passage, if you want to make it like, if you want to induce suffering, then the person who induced the suffering will do it only for a little while during the rite of initiation, and then later on, there would be like a bond. Since you have passed this, you are at my level. And there are many examples of this, but I don't want to get into it. Um, okay. So now O'Brien laid Winston down on the bed. The grip of his limbs tightened again, But the pain had ebbed away, and the trembling had stopped, leaving him merely weak and cold. O'Brien motioned with his head to the man in the white coat, who had stood immobile throughout the proceedings. The man in the white coat bent down and looked closely into Winston's eyes, felt his pulse, laid an ear against his chest, tapped here and there, and then he nodded to O'Brien. "Again," said O'Brien. The pain flowed into Winston's body. The needle must be at 70, 75. He had shut his eyes this time. He knew that the fingers were still there and still 4. All that mattered was somehow to stay alive until the spasm was over. He had ceased to notice whether he was crying out or not. The pain lessened again. He opened his eyes. O'Brien had drawn back from the level. "How many fingers, Winston?" "4. I suppose there are 4. I would see 5 if I could. I am trying to see 5. Which do you wish to so? Which do you wish to persuade me that you see 5, or really to see them?" "Really to see them." "Again," said O'Brien. Perhaps the needle was 80, 90. Winston could not intermittently remember why the pain was happening. Behind his screwed up eyelids, a forest of fingers seemed to be moving in a sort of dance, weaving in and out, disappearing behind one another and reappearing again. He was trying to count them. He could not remember why. He knew only that it was impossible to count them, and that this was somehow due to the mysterious identity between 5 and 4. The pain died down again. When he opened his eyes, it was to find that he was still seeing the same thing. Innumerable fingers, like moving trees, were still streaming past in either direction, crossing and recrossing. He shut his eyes again. "How many fingers am I holding up, Winston?" "I don't know. I don't know. You will kill me if you do that again. 4, 5, 6. In all honesty, I don't know." "Better," said O'Brien. A needle slid into Winston's arm. Almost in the same instant, a blissful healing warmth spread all through his body. The pain was half forgotten. He opened his eyes and looked up gratefully at O'Brien. At the sight of the heavy lined face, so ugly and so intelligent, his heart seemed to turn over. If he could have moved, he would have stretched out a hand and laid it on O'Brien's arm. He had never loved him so deeply as at this moment, and not merely because he had stopped the pain. The feeling that at bottom it did not matter whether O'Brien was a friend or an enemy had come back. O'Brien was a person who could be talked to. Perhaps one did not want to be loved so much as to be understood. O'Brien had tortured him to the edge of lunacy, and in a little while he was certain he would send him to his death. It made no difference. In some sense, that went deeper than friendship. They were intimates, some way or the other, although the actual words might never be spoken. There was a place where they could meet and talk. O'Brien was looking down at him with an expression which suggested that the same thought might be in his own mind. When he spoke, it was an easy conversational tone. "Do you know where you are, Winston?" he said. "I don't know, I can guess. In the Ministry of Love." So, you know, so here we get a different understanding that what we deem as evidence, what we think is true exists, external to consciousness, but it has to be processed through our senses, and we have to reason about it. It requires a sentient brain, and that sentient brain probably doesn't make good decisions. The sentient brain, probably reasons badly. The sentient brain does have a lot of errors in its processing. So, you can't depend upon it. That is a good point. But this whole sort of coercive, uh, coercive, um, persuasion that a being, a body, a person cannot process his version of reality at all. That everything is completely that he's dependent on a complete other narrative or another conscious entity, sentient being, enforcing a view or a perception of life upon him. That is definitely disturbing, and that I don't think it's sustainable, to say the least. And I don't think, and I think that that is an interesting question to consider in the history of biology. How well do these sort of coercive relationships, either within a species or between different species, how do they work out? Okay, so that's the end of readings from 1984. Hmm. So, I don't know. Do you think you know a little bit more about truth? The more you pursue, what truth is, you kind of understand that uh, you would be a little bit of a lunatic or a little bit of a fool to think that there is such a thing as absolute truth, because the more you seek, the more you find out, the more you will have to deal with uncertainties, and uh, that brings us to the next topic about what is knowledge, right? And can anyone know anything? So even though I may not have done a really good job about laying out what is true, I think we have a few tools here and there that are good enough to get by, and I hope you've appreciated it. And maybe I'll come back to this and elaborate upon some other point in detail. But I would like to talk more about knowledge next. So thank you for watching.